Um, Thank you. Thank you very much to the Erich Auerbach Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Cologne for the opportunity to share this project with our German colleagues. And I would also like to thank Professor and friend Wolfram Nietzsche for inviting me to collaborate on this project. And you mentioned my talk 4 year early, earlier. I didn't remember the title, but is on this way of empty spaces also, because it was about the island. Well, and this project has a genealogy, interesting genealogy. So as you know, the plan was to be there today and the whole week working together in present, but unfortunately the pandemic is still around and I have to change my original plans. So I am very sorry. We have the plan B, the Zoom interaction, so we can make the best for this talk. So thank you, Wolfram, for the presentation, the generous presentation. And we can start with the talk. The title is Argentinian Narratives in the Exploration of Emptiness, Territory and Bureaucracy, Fiction and Politics of the Pampas. So in this project, sorry, I want to share the screen because I have a presentation with some images because well, I want to share images also from the movie. In this project, desert stages, empty spaces in contemporary Southern culture, Wolfram and I discussed the idea of spatiality as a problem that is as one aesthetic and ideological. Wolfram focuses on empty urban spaces. I explored the idea of empty space in the deserted expanse of the Argentine plains, the Pampas. I think the counterpoint between the two perspectives problematizes the rural-urban distinction that founded a large part of the spatial imaginary of the River Plate and that retained its aesthetic productivity. This project examines empty spaces in their relationship to aesthetics. In the 21st century Latin American narratives in literature and film, spaces played a central role in the exploration of the social and political meaning and of the communities that inhabit them. Many spaces stand out because they are empty spaces. But what is an empty space? Empty of what? In the world we live in, all physical space contains objects, life, relationship, etc., etc. What culture calls empty spaces are spaces not colonized by prior meanings, but they are also spaces emptied of meaning. Art and literature find there a great opportunity to develop interpretations, but also an opportunity to explore new topics and new meanings, aesthetics reformulations. From an economic perspective, wasteland, for example, have been understood as desert, wilderness, badlands, that is, as an unproductive spaces, imposing a gaze of human supremacy and one that is fundamentally extractivist. These spaces, however, have a productive symbolic life. Its bureaucratic language reduced them to places of passage. Art and literature can appropriate them to create complex territories and uncover another kind of meaning. I agree with Wolfram, who maintains that it is, and I quote, the undefined status of terrain vague as a temporary vacant space, a neglected wasteland that lends it its enduring aesthetic fascination. And now more than ever before, its readily discernible poetic potential, even if perception of it have changed appreciably. End of quote. And he adds, reflecting on the work of Philippe Batset, the desert, I quote, the deserted stretch of land thus become the empty stage for a free-roaming imagination. End of quote. I would like to add that that's imagination in the case of political literature and film is political. In Latin America, there is a rich tradition of artistic production focused on wasteland. In the southern corner, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento's seminal essay, Facundo, 1845, is a powerful description of empty spaces, the Pampas. Before him, many European, especially English travelers who traversed the territory to explore the unknown and for economic gain in the beginning of the 19th century had already described the lands as deserted. Javier Uriarte calls them desert makers. In his book, he suggests that, and I quote, the end of the desert as a representation coincide with the creation of the desert as a void appropriated by the state, as solitudo. The transformation of the arid desert into a productive space first requires the transformation of the desert into deserted. And I have a image here. This is the work of an academic painter, Argentinian academic painter, Prilidiano Pueyrredón. And we see here animals, the workers, and the landowner here of the rodeo. And we see the landscape. This is the Pampa. No geographical irregularities, no trees, no mountains. And because of that, of the 19th century, it was called the desert. What Sarmiento called the desert previously in 1845 was, however, the territory of Argentina's indigenous people, the realm of nomads, of the native inhabitants. Although Sarmiento says that the crossing the Pampas, one fixes one gaze and one see nothing, it had in fact had bustling with life for centuries, a life that for the modernizing elite of the Argentine state had neither value nor meaning, since its economic exploitation would require wiping out any prior organization of the territory. As a critic, Fermín Rodríguez points out, in Argentina literature, and I quote, there are no empty spaces. It was the continuous expansion of the frontier that made it into an empty space, open to conquest and representation by territorial fictions, end of quote. It is there, to that space that was declared empty by the founders of the modern nation, that certain contemporary narratives return even today to explore the layers of meaning that accumulate in that void. Whether as unproductive lands or lands desertified by extractive exploitation, the tradition of the desert remains active today. The memory of the radical boy that founded the nation helped to deploy an imaginary of exploration and fictionalization. What I want to propose is that in this contemporary exploration and fictionalization, we find new ways of politicizing the territory, of reimagining the emptiness of the territory as the basis of a political conception of a space, examining the processes that empty the spaces and then populated them with people, objects, relations, stories. Out of a large body of work on this topic, I want to concentrate today on a particular narrative, a film directed by Mariano Llinás, Historias Extraordinarias, Extraordinary Stories of 2008. In a 3.5-hour film, Llinás develops a sophisticated plot with three main storylines, three main characters, these three men, and numerous minor characters and subplots that stem from them. But it is also a film that revisits the narrative tradition in different genres, the possibilities of visual essay, the chronicle, and the documentary, with an impressive visual imagination. The three stories have a single common thread: the territory, the Argentine Pampas, Sarmiento's desert, and the empty space of much of the literature, essay, and art of the 19th and 20th centuries. This common territory of the stories is traversed time and again, but by foot, by car, by boat, and the characters must decipher it. The void is no longer that of the 19th century, but the void left by neoliberalism, which the 21st century takes up as a problem, as the enigma of what this empty territory hides: extractivism, corruption, illegality, but also the strange wave of creating communities, of reoccupying what has been expropriated. The three main characters are X, C, and H, are common men with boring bureaucratic jobs, but the experience of the Pampas make them into detectives, seeker of signs and meanings, which, however, they will not find. Their territory remains enigmatic. Each of these characters is a kind of conspirator, a subject who operates off the margins, who enacts his minor stories, and who seems invisible within a larger national narrative, within the history with capital H of the nation. Each has an assignment to carry out, has been hired for an institution or person to find or do something. They will not succeed, but will instead produce other stories, achieve something else. This territory is the Pampas again, but the Pampas of the 21st century, the roads and small towns of the province of Buenos Aires. The three stories are told by three voiceover narrators. X, C, and H never speaks in the film. This dynamic where the action is split, we see the images and hear the plot narrated, and they don't always coincide. This dynamic allows us as viewers to focus on the visual story in which the landscape is essential. These mute characters act in a world where nature is neither beautiful nor hostile, as the travelers of the 19th century saw it, but a part of a nation that the state simultaneously dominates and abandons. But it's no longer about the state as a strong actor of Argentine political life. It is now the bureaucracy that organizes the life of the community. In two of the three stories, the protagonists are public servants carrying out a job on behalf of the state. In the third, a public project is investigated with private funds, and the state bureaucracy, corruption schemes, got investment, engineers who want to transform the territory in order to exploit it, smallholders who want to get rich quick, women who led their own life. All these stories cross paths in the Pampas, where the distances are immense and social life appears to be concentrated in the chance encounters in the course of the daily life of the towns, and especially the daily life of the roads and highways. In this lecture, I will concentrate in 2 episodes of this film and then connect them with the third story. Well, I start with the story. In the first story, X is this guy, arrived at the deserted outskirts of a small town at dawn to investigate some monuments. The extraordinary emerged from the emptiness in just 3 minutes. X witnesses a murder, kills a man, steals a legal case file, flees, finds out on a hotel and tries to understand the story in which he has just played a leading role. We come to learn that X had been hired to survey the public works built in the province in the 1930s by an architect, Francisco Salamone, a real architect. I want to pause on this story to explore Llinás' use of the territory and the ways in which he historizes and politicizes it. I'll focus on the chapter of the film called The Son of the Devil. The episode is a photo montage, a few shots, and a powerful voiceover story. The story narrated by the voiceover takes place in the small cities. In the film, they call them towns or village, pueblos, of the province of Buenos Aires that, for the most part, were founded at the end of the 19th century after the Argentine state unified the national territory in 1880. Most of these towns were forts established by the army that fought against the indigenous inhabitants of the territory. I have a map of the province of Buenos Aires here, and these are the towns I was talking about. Many of these towns were founded by European immigrants, the new inhabitants that the Argentine state attracted to populate the desert, Poblar el Desierto, and whiten the nation. This history is evident in the toponyms of the province. We have here some of the towns: Saldungaray, Torkins, Pigüé, are surnames of immigrants who founded agricultural colonies at the end of the 19th century. Other towns owe their names to heroic figures in the history of the province: Coronel Pringles, Laprida, Rauch, Balcarce. Some still have indigenous names: Carué, Saliquelo, Guamini. Within this context, the episode recounts the career of the real Francisco Salamone, 1897-1959, an Argentinian architect born in Sicily, Italy, who in a brief period of 4 years built more than 60 monumental works in the middle of the Pampas, distributed among the 28 towns in the province. He built nothing of note before or after. Between 1936 and 1940s, the government of the province of Buenos Aires, which wanted to modernize the towns, hired him to build town halls, plazas, slaughterhouses, and cemeteries. We must recall that Buenos Aires was a province whose economy was fundamentally dependent on agriculture and cattle ranching. The governor of the province at that time, Manuel Fresco, a conservative with fascist tendencies, wanted to rebuild the province through public works, a project characteristic of the strong government of the period, from the European totalitarian governments to the American New Deal. The 30s are known in Argentina as the infamous decade, la década infame, beginning with the military coup against the popular democratic government of Hipólito Yrigoyen on September 1930. Its series of authoritarian, conservative, and corrupt governments ensued for more than 10 years until the arrival of Peronism. Salamone, the real architect, is hired to transform the reality of the towns, which in the 30s were actually very, very small. Llinás, in calling the cities, the current cities, pueblos, towns, send us back to the moment when Salamone built his monumental works. X, the character, set out to investigate these works. So here the fictional story becomes a sort of folk documentary. Salamone's work are all public buildings, which clearly reveals the priorities of the government: entrench the state, town halls, support the ranching economy, the slaughterhouses, monumentalize death, the cemeteries. The cemeteries are notable for their porticos, and the slaughterhouses and town halls for their towers. I have some images here of the Salamone work. This is the cemetery of the city of Azul, built in 1938. This is the great portico, as you can see. And this is the portico of the cemetery of La Prida, another town. The cemetery of Saldungaray, it's the portico, and you can see this is a picture of a few years ago, and still you see the boy, the pampa empty. This is the slaughterhouse of Azul. Is notorious because the tower is like a knife. The slaughterhouse of Guamini, the Saliqueló, and the Villa Epecuén. We come back to this image later. So this is most of the work of Salamone. This images express the idea of monumentally in the middle of the plains. The portico of the cemetery of La Prida, for example, is 33-meter height. The Christ figurine is 11-meter height. The portico of cemetery of Saldungaray has a diameter of 18 meters. That of Azul is 22-meter height and 43-meter wide. In the middle of the plains in the 30s, these buildings rose up like strange figures, the vertical axis juxtaposed against the horizontality of the Pampas. They were extremely tall buildings for the Pampas, and it's worth recalling that the first skyscraper in Buenos Aires was built precisely in 1936 and was 120-meter high. The city was also very, very low. Salamone built all his work to be seen from very far away, to fill a void, but also to throw into relief the emptiness around them. As Ramos points out, the mangrullo, a kind of watch tower typical of the Pampas in the 19th centuries, served to see and control the territory. Salamone's tower, on the other hand, were made to be seen from the territory. But it's not only the size of this construction that is striking. The figures themselves were strange elements in the small towns. The Archangel Gabriel in the portico of the cemetery of Azul, the head of Christ in the portico of Saldungaray, the Christ of La Prida cemetery, and the towers of the slaughterhouses and the knife. This is what Llinás explored in this fourth documentary on Salamone within a fictional story. The works use architectural styles that were common at the time. The particularity of this architect is that he combines them in unusual ways, sometimes drawing on several different styles within the same work. Thus, we find Art Deco together with German Expressionism, Functionalism, Italian Futurism, and even a touch of Russian constructivism. In a context of low houses and the local Creole style, with courtyards and galleries, with the straight, simple lines of the traditional neo-colonial style of the towns, those faceted facades, those futuristic or cubist Christ, those porticos full of symbols and gigantic figures not only broke the uniformity of the space, but also incorporated disruptive elements. They interrupted the continuity not only of the landscape, but also of history. And finally, they filled these empty spaces with volumes and images that did not speak to the visual history of the inhabitants of the towns, but rather erupted with the novelty of a kind of fierce avant-garde. The film by Llinás explored these contradictions. Salamone's works introduce a problem. They erect incomprehensible signs in the middle of the Pampas. In the figure of Christ, if the figure of Christ is familiar, the facilitated sculpture of the portico of La Prida destroys all traditional harmony. If the Archangel Gabriel is an angel of death, the image looks like something out of an expressionist film, which could surely have been unfamiliar to the residents of the town in the 30s. This is the fascinating things about these works, that they install in an appropriate place and with aesthetic violence, new visual traditions. They fill the void with certain figures that were not well received by the local population, like the decapitated Christ of Saldungaray. The governor, Fresco, wanted the state to occupy a citizen's territory. Salamone appears to have wanted to colonize their visual consciousness, implanting the monumental and strange within these empty plains. He brought urban modernity to the countryside. In 1940, Salamone was accused of corruption and went into exile in Uruguay. He built nothing important after that. The film thus mixes documentary history with its own visual imagination, retrieving the monuments from oblivion, historicizing and politicizing them. And it also shows how the strong state of the 19th century becomes bureaucracy in the 21st century, because X, the character, is an employee to investigate the works of Salamone. And another of the history in the film begins with a bet in a social club. When engineers want to show that there was decades ago a company that tried to dredge the Salado River. which crosses the province. His opponent bets that the river cannot be dredged and that the company was unable to do anything. To one who thinks it can be dredged, the one who thinks the river can be dredged, hired H, the character, to travel the river in search of evidence. Some monoliths built by that company. H set out in a small boat. He doesn't find any monoliths. Soon after the beginning of the trip, H encounters another man, Caesar, on the river. He then learns that this man, who is traveling ahead of him, is blowing up the monoliths that H is looking for. This man was hired by the other better, the one who said the river could not be dredged. H and Caesar make a deal and work together. H photographed the monoliths and then Caesar blows them up. Almost all of the sequence of the story takes place on the river, which is also an emblematic feature of the Pampas. The Salado is a river of a plain whose basin is essential to the economy of the province. This is an image of the river in the film. But like the Pampas, it is empty. It is an empty landscape. The narrator says about the river in the film, and I quote: "The river is as tame and calm as a dirt road in the countryside. Before leaving, someone had told him, H, the character, don't expect much of the river. Don't expect adventures. It's a plains river. It's a desert river, barely a line on a map. It's like you are traveling in the middle of nowhere. Don't expect much. There's nothing on the river." End of quote. In the cultural history of the Pampas, the desert envelops everything, both land and water. This is the character H in the boat, on the boat. The bet is for money as well as a battle of egos. The two men represent the state and the market, and they bet on a natural feature of the province. H and Caesar, the delegates, are the real characters who travel the territory, who experience nature. And nature grows hostile. A great storm makes the river overflow and flood the plain. But the storm passes, the river no longer exists, says the narrator. And the path of the river is totally lost in an immense mass of water. End of quote. Everything is flooded. The characters are lost in the boundless mass of water, where there is no way to orient themselves. These are H and Caesar in the middle of the water. Then they take shelter in a warehouse, that seemed to be abandoned in the middle of the plain, and later they are captured by the army. The flood is another historization of the Pampas. The first description of the Pampas in the 19th century by European travelers compared the plains to the sea, precisely because of the lack of geographical irregularities, because of its monotony, because it was flat and an empty place. In the film, we see the river after the flood, and there is no longer any difference between the land and the water. The historization is not just this allusion to the 19th century text comparing the land to water. Floods pose a constant threat in the Pampas, especially after the neoliberal policies of the 19th, which changed the water system of the province. A few years earlier, in 1985, Lago Epecuén, a tourist town with hot springs, was flooded. This is how the area looks today after the flood. The town is empty and in ruins. Since then, there have been regular floods, and the residents of the area live with the constant threat of losing their crops, their belongings, and in some cases, their lives. This town is near Carué, and where Salamone built the town hall and a slaughterhouse in ruins we see earlier. In 2002, Llinás shot his first film, and one episode occurs in this town. I'll skip this part of the lecture because I think it's late, but we can back to this movie maybe in the Q&A if you are interested and if we have time. So I go to the third story. Is the last story. C is an employee of the provincial bureaucracy. When he first arrived at work, he finds a file that belonged to his predecessor, a map of the province of Buenos Aires with marks on remote towns, a booklet with notes in code, all photos, foreign currency. So this is the third story. She travels through those towns, follows some clues from the file, and discovers that the person whose story he is trying to understand has left a large sum of money in a South African bank account. And that he is the only, she is the only person who knows about the money in the South African bank account. He embarks on a trip across the province that becomes metaphorically a treasure hunt. To find this treasure, he will visit isolated towns, travel side roads, meet people and animals, and finally, after months without doing or thinking of nothing, he will decide to leave the Pampas, to get away from the territory. And this is how the film ends, in South Africa, from the Pampas to South Africa. Thus, a South-South relation is established. No? We have in the map here the Buenos Aires province, the towns, and the last scene of the film is in South Africa. So the connection is south-south. The three episodes, and I finish the lecture now. The three episodes are related in addition to the common setting of the semi-deserted Pampas through the stories that stem from the insipid life of the three characters. All have pointed job, all are alone. They have no project. At the same time, the three narrators, in telling the story, stress that the characters know nothing about what's happening around them. Lost, X, C, and H travel aimlessly across the Pampas. The film could have been a road movie or a contemporary Latin American Western, but it seems to be something else, a collection of tales that can only take place in the middle of nowhere, but full of reference to the past and present. The landscape of the Pampas with layers of history is updated in those episodes. The void of the Pampas is part of the proliferation of stories. The extraordinary stories of the title are ordinary stories in most of the cases that are born in the Pampas, from that dull, dusty place, from those remote towns of the plain, as the narrator described it. But the films does not contradict its own claims. In this empty place, a lot of things happen, from murders to wild animal trafficking, to state corruption, dirty business, love stories. Here, the void has extraordinary stories. The state bureaucracy dominates the territory. Fiction politicizes it. In the cultural context of 21st century Argentina, empty spaces are part of an aesthetic that explores the history of the country through its territory. Empty spaces is never really empty. It is a site in the archaeological sense of the word from which to extract stories. And stories always carry the mark of the remains of the past. Extraordinary stories, the film seems to say that out of nowhere, out of emptiness, aesthetic and politics also emerge. And the empty spaces are there to mark a lack, but also an abundance of senses. Thank you. I finish.